Good morning and welcome to Congregation Agudat Achim's Psalms in Hebrew and Comparative Translations.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, what you want to do is
Sorry.
all right, I removed you, so now you only have one.
Oh, okay. So if I get off the first one, I can get back on.
Well, you're on. I
Okay.
I don't think you have any problem.
Oh, we have our other Rabbi Spitzer.
All right. It was because you were on two, Kathy, you were causing
Okay.
now
Okay.
you're just on your computer, so I think you're good.
Um,
All right.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'll try to do better.
No. You don't have to do anything. It's all done. I booted your phone from
Oh,
so you're
oh,
done. It's all good.
okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. I'm not quite right.
Yeah, you're fine. You're perfect.
Okay.
Just
All right. Thank
be
you.
as you are. You're on your computer now.
Yep.
That's better. Yeah, terrific. All right. Welcome to Psalms in Hebrew and Comparative Translations. We've been doing one psalm every week, most weeks, except not for the last 3 months. We took a hiatus over the course of June, July, and most of August, and now we're returning. We're gonna try to do every week as much as we can, though as we get closer to the high holy days, that definitely a very busy time for rabbis. We'll see if I can keep up the prep work for this class and writing my sermons. I'll let you know by email. But the hope is to meet on Tuesdays. There is one Tuesday in September that I'm going to visit my grandmother in St. Louis, and so we won't meet that Tuesday. All right. This week we're going to look at Psalm 38, and our focus has been and will continue to be thinking about the Psalms as a spiritual practice. So we're going to read through the Psalm in Hebrew and then also in a couple of the different translations that I've provided. And we'll ask the question, what is the dominant emotion in this Psalm? Why might you say it if you were saying this as a prayer, right? In what context might this Psalm make sense as a personal individual prayer? And we'll also talk about some of the like poetry of the psalm, and as it's important, we'll talk about some of the challenges in translation as it leads to greater meaning with respect to the psalm. But we'll start with that question. What is the dominant emotion, and how does it relate to us spiritually? How might we use this psalm? So one thing I'll note about Psalm 38 is that it is not a psalm that is used regularly in Jewish liturgy. In fact, there were only a couple of verses that are mentioned in Jewish liturgy at all, and so this psalm might feel unfamiliar to those of us who are familiar with psalms. Like, we've done a few psalms in the 30s that are in our in our regular Shabbat morning service, right? We looked at Psalm 34, which we know, and several of the psalms in this part of the book of Psalms we actually know in full. This psalm very light on the liturgical connections, but the theme of the psalm is very similar to the theme of many of the psalms that we've read. And so I think we'll find some you'll find some familiarity even in the unfamiliarity. So with that introduction, we'll jump in. Mizmor LeDavid lehazkir. Adonai al beketzpecha tochicheni uvechamatcha tiasreni ki chitzecha nichatu vi vatinchat alai yadecha ein metom bivsari mipnei zamecha Ein shalom ba'atzamai mipnei chatati, ki avonotai avru roshi, kimasa chaved yichbedu mimeni. Hiv ishu namaku chaburotai mipnei ivalti, na'aveti sachoti ad meod, kol hayom koder hilachti. Ki chesalai mal'u nikle, ve'ein mitom bivsari. Nifugoti venid keti ad meod, shagti minahamat libi, Adonai negdecha kol ta'avati, va'anchati mimcha lo nistara. Libi secharchar azavani kochi, ve'or einai gam hem ein iti. O Havai v're'ai mineged nig'i ya'amodu, ukrovai merachok amadu. Vayinakshu mivakshe nafshi, v'dorshe ra'ati dibru havot, u'mirmot kol hayom yegu. Vani kecheresh lo eshma, u'chi'ilem lo yiftach piv. Va'ehi ki'ish asher lo shomea, ve'ein befiv tochachot. Ki lecha Adonai hochalti, ata ta'aneh Adonai Elohai. Ki amarti pen yismechu li, b'mot ragli alai higdilu. Ki ani latzela nachon, u'machovi negdi tamid. Ki avoni agid ed'ag mechatati, ve'oivai chayim atzemu ve'rabu sonai shaker. Umishalmei ra'a tachat tova yistenuni tachat rodfi tov. Al tazveni Adonai, Elohai al tirchak mimeni, Husha le'ezrati, Adonai teshuati. A Psalm of David, Lehazkir. O Eternal One, do not punish me in wrath. Do not chastise me in fury, for your arrows have struck me, your blows have fallen upon me. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your rage, no wholeness in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have overwhelmed me. They are like a heavy burden, more than I can bear. My wounds stink and fester because of my folly. I am all bent and bowed. I walk about in gloom all day long. For my sinews are full of fever. There is no soundness in my flesh. I am all benumbed and crushed. I roar because of the turmoil in my mind. O my sovereign, you are aware of all my entreaties. My groaning is not hidden from you. My mind reels. My strength fails me. My eyes, too, have lost their luster. My friends and companions stand back from my affliction. My kin stand far off. Those who seek my life lay traps. Those who wish me harm speak malice. They utter deceit all the time. But I am like the deaf, unhearing, like the mute who cannot speak up. I am like one who does not hear, whose mouth has no retort. But I wait for you, O Eternal One. You will answer, O my sovereign, my God. For I fear they will rejoice over me. When my foot gives way, they will vaunt themselves against me. For I am on the verge of collapse. My pain is always with me. I acknowledge my iniquity. I am fearful over my sin. For my mortal enemies are numerous. My treacherous foes are many. Those who repay evil for good harass me for pursuing good. Do not abandon me, O Eternal One. My God, be not far from me. Hasten to my aid, O my sovereign, my deliverance. We'll read another translation. This is the King James Version. A Psalm of David to bring remembrance. O Lord, rebuke me not in thy wrath, neither chasten me in thy hot displeasure. For thine arrows stick fast in me, and thy hand presseth me sore. There is no soundness in my flesh because of thine anger, neither is there any rest in my bones because of my sin. For mine iniquities are gone over mine head, as an heavy burden they are too heavy for me. My wounds stink and are corrupt because of my foolishness. I am troubled, I am bowed down greatly. I go mourning all day long. For my loins are filled with a loathsome disease. There is no soundness in my flesh. I am feeble and sore broken. I have roared by reason of the disquietness of my heart. Lord, all my desire is before thee, and my groaning is not hid from thee. My heart panteth, my strength faileth me. As for the light of mine eyes, it also is gone from me. My lovers and my friends stand aloof from my sore, and my kinsmen stand afar off. They also that seek after my life lay snares for me, and they that seek my hurt speak mischievous things, and imagine deceits all the day long. But I, as a deaf man, heard not, and I was as a dumb man that openeth not his mouth. Thus I was as a man that heareth not, and in whose mouth are no reproofs. For in thee, O Lord, do I hope. Thou wilt hear, O Lord my God. For I said, hear me, lest otherwise they should rejoice over me. When my foot slippeth, they magnify themselves against me. For I am ready to halt, and my sorrow is continually before me. For I will declare mine iniquity, I will be sorry for my sin. But mine enemies are lively, and they are strong, and they that hate me wrongfully are multiplied. They also that render evil for good are mine adversaries, because I follow the thing that good is. Forsake me not, O Lord. O my God, be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. So we might come back to some of the other translations, but I'm curious to know what your immediate response is. So what feeling do you have, Mark?
My immediate response when I read it last night for the first time was, here's a guy complaining about old age bitterly. And I can relate to that.
Yeah, do you want to say more?
Uh, Other than it just seemed like he's really complaining about growing old and growing feeble, and apparently he's I don't know what age he was when this was supposedly written, but it's obviously written by a pretty old, decrepit individual.
So the this description of the crooked body, the bent over body, the body whose has no soundness in the flesh. I'm benumbed, I'm crushed, I am pulverized, right? This is a description, Mark says, of aging, of aging. Kathy.
I didn't like this psalm at all when I read it last night. I didn't like it because it sounded like the victim was being punished. But then when I read some more and some of the discussion and read it again today, it was more to me like someone who feels horribly guilty, and pained by what he or she has, in this case, he has done throughout their lives. But I don't believe in a God who personally punishes like that. So uh, I had trouble with that, though the end does come to hope and the person saying, okay, I'm turning it all over to you, God, and I know that you'll help me.
Yeah, so one thing that I noticed about this psalm is many of the psalms that have similar themes that we've looked at um, have a section of the psalm that's in the singular, like this psalm, right? It's my affliction, my suffering, my body, my whatever, my pain. But then at the end of the psalm, there's often a turn to something more communal, national. But the Jewish people has faith in, right, but Israel, that kind of a line. This psalm has none of that. It is individual and personal the whole way through. And one of the interesting things is, and we're going to look at this when we look at the way that the tradition has incorporated some of these verses liturgically, is that in the liturgy, they actually rewrote the verses of the Psalms that they've taken and made them plural, right? Um, Most of our prayers are not in the singular. Most of our prayers are in the plural. When you go to the Siddur, right? The Siddur it's a communal text, right? On Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when we pray for forgiveness, when we acknowledge our sin, when we address our iniquity, it's all in the plural. We do very, very little of the personal guilt, right? You're supposed to do that individually in the context of everybody doing it together, right? It's not that we don't acknowledge that there's individual guilt. Of course we do. But our prayers are done in the plural. And so we actually take these verses and rewrite them into the plural, so that um instead of saying do not abandon me, Adonai, my God, do not be far from me, we say, do not abandon us, Adonai, our God, do not be far from us. Right? And we use that verse in our Rosh Hashanah liturgy, um, in our Yom Kippur, in the Slichot prayers, right? So, and that verse comes up a lot in the high holidays, but rewritten into the plural. So, Kathy, in addressing your point, right? There's a lot of discomfort with this psalm. I think part of the discomfort is this like unrelenting individualness of this psalm, that part of how it feels so blameworthy, so much like the speaker is blaming himself, is because it is so individualized. There's no respite from that. Um, and some of the psalms give us that, and yet I think there's a real power in the individual voice of this psalm. When the psalmist says at the end, hurry to my help, Adonai, my deliverance, it feels like a very, very personal prayer. Um, the you know, I went through life choosing not to hear. I went through life choosing not to respond to the people who tried to attack me, right? A very, very personal approach. Um, Now, with regard to the theology, I, I think you can both believe that God does not cause individual suffering and believe that individual suffering um, has a relationship to the divine, right? When you are in a state of individual distress, I think there's a spiritual benefit in that moment calling out to God, even if you don't think that God directly caused your individual stress. Um, you fell and had a concussion. Well, you don't think God caused you to fall and have that concussion. But in that moment when you fell
I
and
don't know.
had this
It was on
concussion,
Tisha B'Av, so
right?
I've wondered.
Yeah. And you could call out and say, you know, like a heavy burden, this is too heavy for me. God, what have you done to me? Why is this happening to me?
I see it more as a distance from God, not that God did it or does these things to us, but that perhaps we have moved away from God and need to come closer.
Well, great, right, and I think that that's exactly the like the theology of a psalm that casts these kind of personal things in the context of a relationship with God is is a way of saying, even when bad stuff happens, I still want to be in relationship with you, with
Mhm.
the you with a capital Y. I even when it's it even when I feel like I'm going around all day in mourner's black, right? Even when my body is failing me, I still want to be in relationship with God, with the divine, with you, God. And so I'm going to write this prayer that deeply is about that personal relationship. All right. Mark talked, Kathy talked. Anybody else have an initial reaction to the psalm? Yeah, Linda, you have to unmute.
Um, it occurs to me that he's saying all these problems that he has, and he wants God to help him get through them.
Yeah, I think that's right. He says, Adonai, all my desire is toward you. My sighing is not hidden from you. God, my friends and my family, they are at a distance from me, but I know that you're with me in my pain.
Exactly.
Larry.
David and Bathsheba, that episode, at the end of it, after Uriah's been killed at David's urging, uh, it says the Lord afflicted his son. And it's almost as David understood and accepted that there's a price. And Nathan told him the curse that would happen to his family. Yet still, at the end, his kingdom will survive. It'll survive Solomon and all those. So it almost seems like he, as a young man, could have said this after the great sins with Bathsheba and Uriah, especially, that he tried to do good and he picked up and did the best he could, but he still had this heavy price that he knew he was paying, that sort of that grief that was with him all his life as a king.
Yeah, Solomon's older brother, right? The firstborn child of David and Bathsheba dies as a result of this sin. And so then you can understand this psalm if you understand it in the context of the great sins that David has done, right? And I think this is one of the greatest strengths in some sense of the Hebrew scriptures, is that the Bible does not, right? David is the Bible's greatest hero in some sense, right? You know, David is the one from whom the eventual Messiah will descend. David is the what we call in our prayers the first flowering of the redemption, right? And David is this great king of Israel who writes all these psalms and is a great musician and beats Goliath, and everybody loves him, and he has all of this. He's able to expand the borders of the of the country and unite the North and the South, and he has this genius of picking Jerusalem, which is like an unclaimed city, unclaimed by Israelites, by the Jewish people. And obviously, it was a Jebusite city in the first place, but unclaimed by Israelites, either by the north or the south. But Jerusalem is a city on the northern border of the southern kingdom. So he specifically picks not the capital city of the south, which is where his natural seat might have been, and he doesn't pick the capital city of the north, which would have been showing his succession from Saul, right, the previous king. Instead, he picks a new seat of government, right? He has a genius about this, a political savvy, that allows him to hold together a kingdom that Israel and Judea really are two separate entities, but he brings them together, and his power in doing that was so great that he was able to even after his own death hold that kingdom together for another generation. Now, after Solomon's death, the kingdoms split again, and they don't come together until after the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom, and all the northern refugees come down into the south. And then in the time of Josiah, there's another political reform that unifies the kingdoms of the north and the south. And from a biblical critical perspective, it's at that time that the stories of Jacob, which is the forefather of the Israelite kingdom, and the stories of Abraham, which is the forefather of the Judean kingdom, it's at that time when those stories start to come together into one narrative. If you ever wondered why is Isaac such a weak character, right? It's because the northern stories were all about Jacob and his family, and the southern stories were all about Abraham, and they needed to be able to tie them together as one story, right? And if you look at the place names that are mentioned in the Jacob stories, they're all cities in the north, and the Abraham stories are all cities in the south, right? But in the time of Josiah, they bring together the north and the south again because the northern kingdom is destroyed and there are just a lot of refugees who are now living in the south. From that point on, we're one people, one Jewish people. Um, in the time of David, he is holding together the two halves of the Israelite nation. But his personal life is full of sin, even though he is this great hero. And I think one of the great strengths of the Hebrew scriptures is that it doesn't hide that. It's not a hagiography, right? It's the hagiography is the fancy word for a story of a saint, right? David is our greatest hero, but he does not achieve sainthood in this in that sort of classic sense of, oh, he's a perfect person. No, in fact, the whole point is that David sins so deeply, and because of that sin, his heart cracks open. He's a good leader in part because he is so regretful. He's done this great teshuvah, this great turning back, turning away from the sin that he made, right? He had lust over another man's wife and he kills him. And not directly, but indirectly. I mean, pretty directly, because he's the king. And and so he is a real that is a very bad thing to have done. And so you could read this psalm not as being about the body breaking down of old age, but about the ravages of the guilt of sin that can happen on your body. And so then when you read, my loins are filled with burning, there is no soundness in my flesh, it has a different connotation than when you think about it as old age, right? Or I am benumbed, I am crushed, I am pulverized, I moan from the anguish of my heart, right? That line makes more sense if you're reading it in terms of the uh the guilt and the sin than if you're reading it in terms of I'm an old person. On the other hand, right, there's also this language of my body is crooked, bent over, bowed down. Like that language, very easily could be about old age. And I think this psalm lends itself toward multiple readings. Yeah, Mark.
I keep thinking, where's his urologist, his cardiologist, and his osteopath?
Yeah,
I
right.
still say it's about. I get the impression that David wasn't all that conscious of his sins when he was feeling good, and to me, this is now you're punishing me. It's like a guy that smoked 10 packs of cigarettes a day and gets lung cancer and he's bewailing God because of all this. He's talking about all his sins. Maybe his biggest sin was he wasn't very healthy. Just my thought.
Yeah, right. I mean, look, we bodies do decay over time.
Tell me about it.
They aren't the same as they were when we were younger. Yeah. I think your insight into the fact that, nowadays maybe we go to see so many different specialists. We maybe miss the opportunity to say a prayer like this, because thank God we're getting treatment for our pain. Any other first thoughts about how you might use this. How might you use this prayer if you were going to say it? Larry.
We aren't the only ones who sin. And it's an encouragement to really search yourself and see what it is you've covered up about yourself that you never really dealt with. What is that sin? What is that state that you really need to expose and deal with yourself? If David could do this, then it behooves us to do it as well. And there's always hope looking to God.
Anyone else? Right, so one thing that jumped out at me about this psalm is the superscription. Mizmor LeDavid lehazkir. There are only 2 psalms that have that superscription. I think the other one is Psalm 70. The meaning of the Hebrew is unclear. Obviously, it comes from the root Zayin Kuf Resh, which we know relates to memory or to being reminded. But it could mean to be reminded in different in different ways. So let's look at how different translations have tried to understand this this word lehazkir. The Revised Jewish Publication Society are the the most recent JPS translation doesn't translate it, though there is a note. Where's my copy of that? There's a note. I think it says meaning of Hebrew uncertain. Psalm 38. Yeah, it says meaning of Hebrew uncertain. So that's why they didn't translate it. They just let it be lehazkir as that word. The New International Version, that's a Christian translation, translated it as a petition. A petition. So in as much as lehazkir means to remind, a petition is a reminder for someone else, right? To cause it to be remembered by someone else. To remind as a causative verb, not to remind yourself, but to remind someone else. What else have we got? So the old JPS translation says to make memorial, right? To make memorial. The Koren Bible translated as for invocation. For invocation. The Koren Tehillim by Rabbi Eli Kashdan says lehazkir, right? Same as what the new JPS translation did. The King James Version says to bring remembrance, which is not dissimilar from to make memorial. To bring remembrance, right? To cause to remember. I don't often read the translation from the Rashi Ketuvim. I include it because I think it's really interesting. This is a guy who translated Psalms based on Rashi's interpretation of the Psalms. So he does a lot of adding, interpretive words. It's not like really a direct translation. It's really in some ways, whatever. Every translation is an interpretation. This particular interpretation specifically wants to incorporate the explanations that Rashi gives. So he translates it, a Psalm of David to recite in time of affliction. Which I think in some way is similar to the translation of an invocation. But it specifically says, right, how might you want to use this prayer? You want to use it when you are in a time of affliction, to recite in a time of affliction. The contemporary English version says a prayer in times of trouble. That's very similar to what Rashi said, right? To Rabbi Shraga Silverstein's, use of Rashi. And Robert Alter says to call to mind. To call to mind. So what does it do for us that basically this is most of Psalms don't have this appellation. So like how does it affect our understanding of the prayer or the mental state that we have when we go into it? When we have this question of what does lehazkir mean? Who is being reminded? Why are we being reminded? And that, I think, is beautifully lifted up by the meditation on the spiritual uses of the psalm from the Korah and Tehillim, that I often share this meditation as part of our class. And the meditation here uses the word lehazkir in 3 different ways, as if to say, actually, not translating it is the best way, because when you don't translate it, you can understand it in all of the above, right? You can understand it as an invocation, as a reminder, to call to mind, right? To call to mind is for myself, and as a reminder for someone else, right? I wish I could forget the pain, the shame, and the unspeakable horror. Lazkir, to remind myself. I suffered in silence. I never talk about it. Lazkir, to record for eternity. I was desperate, hopeless, alone, and abandoned. Lazkir, to have God remember me. Three different ways of thinking about this term, and how we might use it spiritually. I wish I could forget the pain, the shame, and the unspeakable horror. Right? That, I think, relates to this idea of guilt and sin, and maybe the sin with Bathsheba, and right, in our own lives, the things that we feel guilty about or that we're ashamed of. And lehazkir, to remind ourselves of our past actions, to remind ourselves of our pain, to remind ourselves, right? Because we are holding ourselves in that moment. I suffered in silence. I never talk about it. That, to me, that lifts up my family has abandoned me. My friends have abandoned me. Right. I'm a man, and in our society, men are supposed to, or there's a toxic cultural assumption that men are supposed to suffer in silence. To be honest, I think there's also a cultural assumption that women are supposed to suffer in silence, to just grin and bear it. And so Lazkir, to record for eternity. Now, don't be silent. Break that silence. Write a poem, right? That poem gets, included in this book of Psalms, and then everybody reads it for forever. I was desperate, helpless, alone, and abandoned. Lehazkir is about that relationship that we were talking about with Kathy's comment earlier. Lehazkir, to have God remember me, right? To be in relationship with God, even in these moments of feeling deeply abandoned. Thoughts, reactions? Yeah, Mark.
I keep thinking of the phrase, if I knew I was going to live so long, I would have taken better care of myself. I can see David saying, if I knew I was going to live to old age, I would have maybe not sinned so much. And I'm hoping God will erase some of that.
Yeah. Larry.
When David was leaving Jerusalem, a guy from Saul's camp, an old guy, was throwing stones at him. And the soldiers all said, and he was cursing him for all the evil he'd done to Saul and he was bringing all David's errors to mind. And David said, leave him alone. He's got a point. And it almost lets you put yourself into David's mind at that point. Here he's being castigated for everything he's done, and his friends all want to rush to his aid. And he says, leave him be. Don't go kill that old guy. He's got a real point throwing rocks at me. It's helpful to me almost.
Yeah.
It's such a reality to David when you think about the negatives and let you identify with them. And so it's not so bad that I feel these horrible things David did too. And God counted that to him as righteousness.
Yeah.
Because I try to do right.
Yeah. I recognize the wrongs that I've done. Kathy.
I just was struck by the power of it as we head into Elul and the high holidays. That if David could be experiencing all this for such great sins, that it's easier for us to look at what we may have done. I don't think any of us have sinned to that extent where if it was God or whatever, that we would be punished and so hurting. But we certainly have sinned and made mistakes, and it's a good time to be reminded of that.
Nice. And that, I think, connects very beautifully to this comment that Richard Levy has about this psalm. Sometimes, as we prepare for the high holy days, we feel overwhelmed by the wrongful things we have done in the past year, or the good things we failed to do. Sometimes we attribute our sins to other forces, people in our lives, destructive tendencies in our personalities, wrong choices we made or were made for us as we were growing up. This is a psalm to be read at such times, not only before the high holy days, but obviously there's a connection, when we often feel worthless, alone, benumbed, trapped in our fevered frame. We too sometimes resort to childlike behavior. I can't hear you. I can't hear you, which I think is what he's referring to, those lines about being like a deaf man who cannot hear, or being like a mute person who does not respond. I think that's what he is referring to when he says that there's like a childlike insistence on shutting out the truth, right? Because at such times we often feel like children again, powerless before the greater forces in the world, right? Powerlessness is a huge theme in spirituality, and and especially in spirituality as it relates to our own sins, as our own also to aging, right? This psalm has a simple suggestion for when we are in such a state. For you, Adonai, do I hope. For you, Adonai, do I hope. However we conceive of God, to invite the Holy One into our life, to strive to feel the presence of the one who created us in love. Do not abandon me. Do not be far from me. Can remind us that we are always accompanied, always in the presence of compassion. With such a reminder, we can face the reproof of God that comes into our minds without anger, without rage, and we can say, all of my desire is toward you. You can hear my sighs, even as I try to shut out the taunts of others, the taunts of myself. If this psalm was offered at the time of the Azkara remembrance offering, perhaps we might prepare a little Azkara offering for ourselves, gathering a journal, letters, photos, articles, evidence of our worth in the world, and saying to God, I set these before you and before myself as a reminder of this noble being you created, as a reminder that I am the child of the creator of everything that is. You have hurt me. You have sent barbs my way, but I need you. and I believe I am worth your attention. Hurry to my help, Adonai, my deliverance. I think it's a really beautiful way of understanding this psalm. And Kathy, I totally hear that on first read, this psalm is challenging. And yet I think there's a real beauty in the sort of stark reality, the truth that this psalm is telling about what it means to live an embodied life in this world, like both in terms of our actual physical ailments and in terms of our psychological well-being. And this connection of the psalm to the high holy days, it is deeply rooted in our tradition, because the only liturgical places where this psalm comes up is related to Yom Kippur, related to our penitential prayers, right? Verse 5 is used in an anthology of verses in the Edot HaMizrach tradition, the Sephardic Jewish tradition of a person who has declared for themselves a personal Yom Kippur, which is called a Yom Kippur Katan. As some people do a Yom Kippur Katan once a month, related to Rosh Chodesh. I think it's either the Thursday before Rosh Chodesh or something like that. I'm not actually don't 100% know, but you can also declare for yourself a Yom Kippur Katan anytime you think you have a personal sin that you want to atone for. And there's a tradition of that bride and groom on the day of their wedding have a Yom Kippur Katan. That's the tradition of fasting from when you wake up in the morning on the day of your wedding until after your wedding is done, right? Until the reception. There's a tradition of fasting, and that comes from this idea of the Yom Kippur Katan. In fact, the Chatan and the parties to the marriage, whether that's two grooms or a bride and a groom or two brides or whatever, the parties to the marriage of whatever genders they are invited to, in fact, say the al chaitz, those prayers of um, uh, confessing wrongdoing that we say on Yom Kippur. There's a tradition of saying them on the morning of your wedding. And in fact, there's just like Yom Kippur is in some sense a death and a rebirth, like you're entering into a new year free of sin, in part because Yom Kippur simulates sort of a death. That's why we wear white and we don't eat and we don't drink, right? Like the dead person also doesn't eat or drink. So we come out of Yom Kippur kind of renewed. There's a tradition that you're forgiven from all of your previous sins on the day of your wedding. So immediately following the chuppah, you are considered sinless, free of sin. And that also is connected to this concept of the Yom Kippur Katan. It's also connected to the tradition of asking for blessings from the bride and groom. So, if you've ever been to a wedding and had somebody line to ask to receive a blessing, one of the reasons why the bride and groom are considered able to give those blessings, I say bride and groom, but I mean of all genders, are able to give those blessings is because they are in this pristine state of sinlessness, having entered into a new phase of their life. Their unmarried selves have been have died in some sense, and now they have entered into a new phase of being married. And so there's I think verse 5, Ki avonotai avru roshi k'masach haved yichbedu mimeni, that my sins are weighing down my head like a heavy burden. They've become too much for me. Right, that line is included in this Yom Kippur Katan liturgy. But verses 16 and 22, the ones that if any of these verses were familiar, it would be those two verses. Ki lecha Adonai hochalti atata ne Adonai Elohai. That is repeated over and over in the Yom Kippur liturgy, and also Al tazveni Adonai Elohai al tirchak mimeni, which we as I said before, we rewrote Al tazvenu Adonai Eloheinu al tirchak mimenu. But when you hear it like that, it's like, oh yeah, I recognize that from the Yom Kippur liturgy, because in fact that's in this section of called Shema Kolenu, where you actually have to repeat that after the Chazan, so several times. When we do the Shema Kolenu section, Al tazvenu Adonai Eloheinu al tirchak mimenu. Do not abandon us, Adonai our God. Do not distance from us. Right? Ki lecha Adonai hochalnu atata ne Adonai Eloheinu. In fact, that both of those verses, 16 and 20 and 22, are used in that same paragraph. And I think I've said this before, but as we are studying this together, I have this hunch that when the rabbis take verses from Psalms and mix and match them and create an anthology, but they take, one verse or two verses from a particular psalm, I am convinced, I think that they want you to import the emotional resonance of that psalm into the new prayer that they are creating. I think that by taking these two verses, they want you to call to mind the emotional resonance of this psalm. They were like, okay, what two verses would be the most would call this psalm to mind to you? And I think that's how they're using it. Not just that they like the words of those verses, but also that they want you to be connected to what we've been talking about this whole time, the guilt and the hope and the connection to God and old age and sin and suffering in silence and having God remember you, and right, all of that I think is tied up in these two verses, and I think that's what they're trying to import into our High Holy Day services. There was one other phrase from this psalm that comes into our liturgy, and that's the phrase umachovi negdi tamid, right? Which negdi tamid is a phrase you recognize, like to place God before you always. Here it's instead of I place God before me always, it's my pain is before me always. And I think it's a direct overturning of the more familiar line. Ashiviti Adonai lenegdi tamid, right? I place God before me always. And here the psalmist says, my pain is negdi tamid. My pain is before me always. Anyway, that line, tamid means always, but it also refers to the always sacrifice, the continual sacrifice. That is to say, like we say, ner tamid, the continuous flame, and the tamid was the daily offering, and the always offering, the offering that was offered in the temple every day. And Shivas Arba Tammuz, the fast of the 17th of Tammuz, there are several things that are commemorated on that day, right? It's 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av. We just observed Shivas Arba Tammuz, 6 weeks ago. The Shivas Arba Tammuz inaugurates the beginning of those 3 weeks that are called Bein HaMetzarim, right? The 3 weeks of constriction that lead up to Tisha B'Av. The main thing that we mention is the destruction of the breach of the walls, right? We have one fast day usually it happens in January, called Asara B'Tevet. That is the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. And then this is the end of the siege of Jerusalem, but the walls have been breached, right? 9 months later, or 8 months later, or whatever, they got through. And now they're in now the ones who are set on destroying the temple have broken through the walls of Jerusalem and are in the city. It takes them 3 weeks to finally destroy the temple, right? They don't do it on that first day when they breached the walls. It takes them 3 weeks to control the city enough to be able to actually destroy the temple. But one of the things that happens when the walls are destroyed is that the continual offering, the tamid offering, is no longer offered. So this verse, "My pain is before me always," does not actually refer to the tamid offering, but because it uses that same word, it is quoted poetically to refer to that. So I couldn't find a translation, so I'll just translate for you. B'chodesh harivi'i, in the 4th month, that's the month of Tammuz, okay? That's the 4th month, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, right? Even though we tend to think of Tishrei as being the 1st month, in fact, the rabbinic tradition understands Nisan as being the 1st month. So Tammuz is the 4th month. Dimiti alot mitit hayavan ve'ein ma'amid, right? I saw the sacrifice being unable to be stood up. B'shiv'asar bo hayiti leviza lemachal ulehashmid, right? And on the 17th day of the 4th month, there was destruction of food in foodstuffs in the cities. Below matzati manoach, and I was unable to find rest. Umachovi negdi tamid, and my pain is before me always. Kivo butal hatamid, because on that day the tamid offering was nullified. Okay, so the reason why the tamid offering was nullified is because they weren't able to. There weren't lambs. They weren't able to find the necessary animals to be able to, after 8.5 months of siege and and the enemy armies on the streets, there no longer are animals to be able to offer. And so the ending of this continuous sacrifice is one of the things that we mourn on the 17th of Tammuz. And this phrase, Machovi Negdi Tamid, is associated with that destruction. All right. Let's close with I'll read another translation. I'll read the translation from Richard Levy, and then we'll close out, and hopefully we'll be back next week with Psalm 39. A Psalm of David, Lehazkir. Adonai, do not chastise me when you are angry, nor chasten me in the heat of your rage. For your barbs have penetrated me deeply, your hand has pressed deeply against me. Because of your indignation, there is no soundness in my flesh. Because of my sin, there is no wholeness in my bones. For my iniquities have surged over my head. Like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds have festered, they stink because of my folly. My body is crooked, bent over, bowed down. All day long I go about in mourner's black. For my foolish loins are filled with burning, and there is no soundness in my flesh. I am benumbed, I am crushed, I am pulverized, I moan from the anguish of my heart. Adonai, all my desire is toward you, and my sighing is not hidden from you. My heart goes thump, thump. My strength has abandoned me, and the lights of my eyes, they too are gone from me. Those who love me, who've befriended me, stand back from my fevered frame. Those once close to me now stand farthest away. Those who seek my life strike out at me. Those who pursue my pain declare destruction and mutter treacheries all day long. But I am like a deaf person, I do not hear, and like one who is mute, whose mouth moves not. Let me be like a let me be like a person who does not hear, and in whose mouth there are no chastisements. For you, Adonai, do I hope. You yourself will respond, Adonai, my God. For I said, they rejoice over me when my foot slips, they aggrandize themselves against me. For I am about to stumble, my pains are ever before me. I declare my crookedness, I agonize over my sin. Yet my enemies are alive with strength, and those who falsely hate me are increasing. Those who repay wickedness for good stand in the way of those who seek good. Do not abandon me, Adonai. My God, do not be far from me. Hurry to my help. Adonai, my deliverance. Thank you, everyone. It's good to be back.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good to be
Rabbi.
back. Nice to see everybody.
Yeah.
Good to see you all.